Today we're going to doing a board buying guide for the Skimboarding Reddit and Discord. It's going to kind of go in two parts. The first part is going to be more about like beginner skimboard buying and prices and values. And then we're going to move into more custom boards, theory crafting, everything between shapes and sizes and how they affect your location for skimboarding, what you would or would not want to get. So we're going to start with beginner boards. Which board you should likely get first. Some of you will have already gotten a very cheap board like a wooden board or the Wavestorm board from Walmart or something like that. And maybe some of you haven't gotten that already and are looking into this video because you feel like maybe that's not the right board to get, which is probably closer to the truth, particularly if you are a young adult or especially an adult. Those boards are suitable for really children only, maybe 100 pounds max, which will bring us, I'll go over size charts later and how they're misleading to say the least. So I have a list of the commonly available skimboards from the three larger brands, Exile, Victoria, and Zap, in front of me with the prices. And I'm just going to try to quickly go over these prices and what boards might be good for that price or may seem bad for that price that you should be avoiding. At the very low cheap end, you have the Victoria Woody for $110. There's nothing good or bad about this board. If you want to get into the sport with the sort of least amount of initial investment, then you can go for this. But the reality is, especially for used, if you are in an area where you can get used boards, you can probably find just a board just like it for $50 or less on, Facebook, OfferUp, Craigslist, etc. There's of course nothing wrong with getting a small wooden skimboard for your child who is in like the 100 pounds or less range. That's fine. For all of the more young adults or adults who are hitting more into the 150 or even 200 pound range, this board shouldn't necessarily, and this board I mean the Victoria Woody, it shouldn't be on your radar at all. You really need to go up and up to, I would say, at least like 50 inches of skimboard for sort of like 150 pounds and more, depending on the actual shape and size of it. So for 150, you have the Laser from Zap. That is basically a wood skimboard. It has a lot of the size and properties of a wooden skimboard, just made out of fiberglass. That again is for probably kids 100 pounds or less. The boards we really want to be looking at for your first skimboard, if you're taking it seriously and not just getting sort of a Costco board, would be the EXO from the Exile, the Foamy 2 from Victoria, and the Zap Wedge and Fish. These boards are going to be in the $150 to $200 range, generally speaking. The most important thing is that they have decent thickness, and two of them apparently now come with epoxy resin. So Zap makes it a little bit hard to find out which materials they have, but I do believe the Wedge and Fish are a polyester resin. Exile's EXO is with epoxy resin, and then the Vic Foamy just got updated, hence being called the Foamy 2.0, and that actually comes with epoxy now, and that would make it, to my knowledge, the cheapest retail epoxy skimboard on the market. So if you are a beginner skimboarder who is a little bit heavier, like a young adult or adult, or if you've already gone through the whole wooden board process or a Costco Wavestorm board process, and you're looking for a board that actually functions, these are the three models that are going to basically get you in the sport for $200 or less. Exile, EXO, Vic Foamy 2.0, and a Zap Wedge or Fish. Now the mid-range skimboards are very weird to talk about, so typically anything from like $200 to $400 or even $200 to $500. These boards have improvements that I can't speak on necessarily. Most of them are still using e-glass. They're still using epoxy or even polyester at times. Each company will say various things on how it's an improved board, but ultimately you are still getting only e-glass construction. Not only should you avoid these boards because they're e-glass, but we're also into the price range. Once we get past 200, we're in the price range where we can find used carbon boards or just cheaper carbon boards that are more in the $400 to $500 range. So there's a lot of these models. From Exile, you have the EX1, EX2. From Victoria, you have the Glide, the Ultravac, or even the Polyvac with the e-glass option chosen. And Zap, there's a ton of e-glass only models. Almost all of them are, aside from like 2 or 3. All those models that you see are actually e-glass, and if they're $300, $400, or even $500 and it's still e-glass, I can't recommend that for long-term durability, as well as the rigidity of the skimboard, which when you have a carbon epoxy construction, you're going to get a much more rigid sandwich construction, and that's going to lead to more feedback, and it's going to feel better to skim on. And there's not much to say about the carbon epoxy options from each brand. Those boards are going to be great construction-wise. Anybody who's doing a solid carbon epoxy sandwich is probably going to be making a good board, whether it's Exile, Victoria, Zap, or another brand. I'll also mention that if you get a carbon epoxy board, to a certain extent it'll hold its value better because that strength of board is not going to fall apart, whereas if you were to buy like a $400 or $500 e-glass board and it starts falling apart so much and has visible repairs everywhere on the board, and you go to resell that board with the appearance that it has and in the shape that it's in, you're arguably going to lose a lot more percentage of that initial retail that you bought than if you were to buy carbon epoxy. So e-glass, acceptable in that like 200 or less range, maybe 250 or less range if you're including like tax or shipping, but I really can't recommend it from about 250 to 500, given how much wear and tear e-glass board will take over time. So I want to go over size charts really quick. The too long didn't read version of this is that size charts just aren't worth looking at or mentioning. At best, they are guidelines. If you look at each size chart for each model, you'll notice things that are just done so that it makes sense to sell that model to any budget. Anybody of any weight can buy anything of any budget, even though the sizes don't really make sense. So, and this goes basically across all brands. For Exile, if you buy a medium EXO board at 48 inches long, that's the cheap e-glass epoxy construction, the top limit is 170 pounds. If you're to buy a carbon epoxy pro shape in extra small, which is also 48 inches long, the max weight for that board is 110 pounds. So ultimately nearly the same amount of volume and is a completely different weight limit. And also it doesn't even make sense. I mean, the cheaper board would flex more, so you couldn't really be putting a 170 pound person on that board, but that's what the size chart says. And then, you know, for the carbon, that thing is so rigid, even at that smaller size, that one could take a 170 pound person, but instead they only say 110 pound max. So if you're ever going to use a size chart, you always want to use it for the carbon epoxy board, because that one's more close to the truth. That one's telling you what the board is really capable of. The size charts for cheaper boards are telling you a guideline of what size or what board you can get for what you can afford, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily right. It's a little bit misleading. And again, this is for all companies. For Victoria's Foamy, a 48 inch medium board has a max of 130 pounds. For a custom Vic board, a 50 inch long board has a max of 100 pounds. Why would a board with the same shape and 2 inches longer be acceptable for 30 pounds less of a human? So these are sort of marketing tactics, if you will. To a certain extent, Zap gets a little bit closer to the truth on their size charts, especially because they're the only company I've seen that reports the volume, the literage, how much volume a board has is sort of like how much material it has, how much you actually have under you, and that is measured in liters. But even when they report the literage, we still run into these same little weird issues where a zap fish has more volume, more liters of volume than a large wedge, but the fish is labeled as 10 pounds less for the max weight. The more volume you get, the more weight you could support. So ultimately, size charts are misleading, to say the least. Your best bet for size, especially because all shapes of boards are different and like thickness, is to go to a community like the Skimboarding Reddit or Discord and talk to people about, your skill level if you're a beginner. Your location is very important, and of course, your weight is the ultimate issue with sizes for skimboards. And lastly, for sizing, people like to do this really weird, like hockey stick thing with height, saying that if your board is sort of between your sternum and your chin, that it's like a good size board. This is, it's a decent guideline thing. It's a rule of thumb thing that works for your average board, but what if it's 5'8" thick pro shape board? What if it's a 1" thick dude cruise? Those are completely different boards, even if they're the same length and coming up to the same spot on your body. What if you're really short, but you're 200 pounds? What if you're super tall, but you're only 150 pounds? Then suddenly, because you're an outlier, that doesn't work anymore. So don't do a basic thing. Don't do an average thing. Treat all these things as guidelines. If you want hard information, you're going to need to go to the community and ask them for your specific situation. Also, some of these companies change how thick a model is in between sizes, and they barely seem to mention how different it is, how that board's going to handle a totally different volume when you're going from a 5/8 like medium to a 3/4 large or something. Zap recommends on their website smaller boards for beginners. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Like they would say you could size down on the size chart. If anything, you might want to size up, because a larger board will create a more stable platform that'll be a little bit easier to stand on and learn the initial parts of skimboarding with. Also, a larger board is going to float longer and carry you a bit more, a little bit faster with all that extra volume, which is going to help when you're a beginner and you're not that fast. If anybody should be riding a smaller board or sizing down, it should actually be experts who know what they're doing and can run really fast, and maybe they're in really challenging conditions where a smaller board will turn faster and such. All right, I'm going to try to go over the options that you will come across in skimboarding in general, but especially if you buy a custom board and you have to choose everything, you're going to come across these options, and we're going to go over which options you have and how they affect the board that you ultimately buy. So for skimboarding thickness, generally a 5/8 thick board will be for big wave skimmers who need to cut the rail really hard at fast speeds, or technical skimmers who want a lot of that feedback. A real thin board will give you just a little extra feel and feedback when you go to pop and do tricks. A 3/4 thick board would be for people in smaller wave conditions where they might need some more volume, like the waves are slow on the East Coast and you need that thicker board to just help push you along, or a heavier weight rider. And then if you're buying a custom Exile, you do have the option of a tapered board, which is a really good average thickness for skimmers that are a bit more surf-like in their approach, and they're riding in sort of average medium conditions. Maybe not the best for technical stuff, and maybe not even the best for smaller wave stuff, but if you just have average conditions, average wave height, tapered option is a good option. When it comes to the finish of the board, in between things like gloss and textured, gloss, it looks great. We would all love to have a gloss board, but it's known to crack more, and when it does crack, that crack tends to spread a little bit easier, and so They're typically known as just weaker boards. And then the old style of textured boards is more durable, and it's even considered a bit lighter. But if it's like an old true texture, I personally don't like those. There's literally like grooves and divots in that deck, and it gets super dirty. You can't get wax out. It's annoying. And that's why a bunch of companies moved on to this more matte finish, this new texture that adds texture and durability to the board, but it doesn't get as dirty. It doesn't require as much sanding for you to put down your traction pads. Generally speaking, I would say everybody use that matte option, that new texture. Definitely not gloss. If you have to go textured with the old style, go textured, but try to look for matte if possible. So for rocker options, if you are ordering from Exile or Victoria, it's kind of simple. The bigger waves that you are riding and like the steeper beach, the more critical the conditions, the more rocker you want. The flatter and slower those waves are, the less rocker. Also, if you do plan to be a more technical skimmer, you want to bring that rocker down, even if you're at a place with bigger waves, because that's going to help you a little bit with consistent tricks. With that said, the majority of people can just use the standard rocker, the hybrid rocker, whatever is kind of recommended. If you're on like the East Coast and maybe on like the Gulf side, you simply don't need that much rocker. You can do with the flatter options. And then if you're like in Orange County, or if you're in Mexico at like Cabo or whatever, and you know the waves are basically overhead on shore, then you go for that higher rocker option, the Samstonet rocker, to help you in those conditions. Deck channels, which I'm so glad this feature came back. They're not that important. They're not critical. If you don't like the look of them, then don't get them. But I do recommend them because I believe with how they work, they actually increase the board's rigidity and reduce the potential of a snap or a crack to go all the way through the board and break the board outright. Ironically, I don't think they're very good or useful for like grabbing your board like people might think. I guess it helps a little bit, but the real benefit would be that it ultimately makes a stronger board. So if you're only spending $20-$40 to get that feature, especially if you're buying an expensive board, you might as well spend that money and have it be more durable for the long term. Glassing options, to my knowledge, Exile is the only one doing this. I wish every company would do it, and to a certain extent they probably do. If you are to order like a custom board from Victoria, you can put in the special notes, I'd like an extra layer of glass on the bottom. I doubt they would say, no, we can't do that for you. Depends. They might charge you extra, whatever. But for Exile, they have these options standard. You have the standard glass, you have the DuraWeight, which would be probably an extra layer of glass on the bottom, and then the comp weight, which I don't know if they take a layer off the top or off the bottom, but that option has always terrified me. I would recommend everybody go standard or go for the DuraWeight, because Exile boards are the lightest boards on the market to my knowledge, and making them heavier is fine. It's a good thing, if anything. If you buy a standard board and it snaps, you're going to be kicking yourself for not going DuraWeight, whereas if you go DuraWeight and the board is fine and taking less damage with that extra layer of glass, you're not really going to be kicking yourself, oh, it's a fraction heavier. It's not going to matter in the long run. If anything, it's better because it's helping you battle windier conditions, and overall it's more durable in the long term. So rail profile, which is offered by Victoria. I'm not sure if Exile has this option or if anybody else does it, but I'm just going to talk about Victoria since they're the one that I know that does this. First of all, with the rail profile, a lot of it will have to depend on thickness. So if you have a 5/8 thick board, so probably like the thinnest board that you can get custom, you'll want to go for boxy rails to add more volume into that rail area. The board is already thin enough to help you turn fast. Now what you need is to add that volume back into the rail, since the board would technically be not floating as much or going as fast with less volume. And that'll help you push through that turn and make it on a 5-inch thick board. For 3-4, a standard rail profile would be nice. Not boxy, not tapered, just a standard sort of hybridized rail profile to match that sort of standard size thick board. And then if you were to do a 1-inch option, I don't know if Victoria does this anymore, but you would have to go tapered. I did make a 1-inch board in the past and had told the shaper to keep the rails boxy, and he said, no, that will not work. And he was 100% right. He tapered the rails out more, and if he had not done that, the board is already very difficult to ride. It takes a very skilled rider to ride that board. If he had made the rails the way I had suggested, more boxy at 1 inch, it would have been completely bust, just an unrideable board. And then what are these rail profiles good for riding style wise? So if you were to get a thin 5/8 board and do tapered rails instead of boxy, what would that be like? Well, that'd be great for bigger, faster waves and a skimmer who's more surf-like, just focused on wave riding, being able to turn fast and hold the line. Boxy rails are going to be better for people in smaller waves because you have more volume on rail when you turn in. And then technical skimmers, you're just going to have a bit more volume on the edge when you go for that pop, and that'll give you more feedback and response on your tricks, so it'll be more consistent when you're doing that. And lastly, but not least, of course, is shapes. So generally speaking, the pointier the board, or more surfboard-like it is, obviously the more surfboard-like it'll perform, and it'll perform better on bigger waves, turning sort of on-water functions. The rounder or fatter a skimboard shape is, the more skateboard-like that board will be, especially in a twin-tip configuration, and the better for smaller waves where you have more outline, more overall volume to be under your feet while you're on the wave. A fishtail is going to give you faster turns, especially on smaller waves. I wouldn't necessarily recommend them in really big waves, big conditions like Orange County, because it could take a lot of skill to handle that twitchy, super fast turning fishtail. And then if you were to use a squash tail like on most modern surfboard shortboards, that's going to slow down the turn and make it a bit more consistent. Also, I find squash boards to be pretty good for tricks because when they slow down the action at the tail, it'll make it a more consistent and predictable for you to get the pop off on your tricks and get it right every time. That said, 99% of riders should be using just sort of a hybrid type lift shape with a rounded pin tail and sort of a standard pin type nose. Most of the boards that are not shaped sort of like a hybrid lift are just kind of a gimmicky niche thing. Like these new Zap boards that are coming out with these sort of diamond tails that are just sort of a weird compromise between a pintail and a squash tail, or a pintail and a fish. You'd just be better off with the standard board, something really predictable and consistent like a rounded pintail. That said, with everything in this video, I do want to top it all off with most of these things kind of don't matter in the long run. Get the board you can get, skim with it the way you want to skim. The most important thing, obviously, is that you get a board and have fun on it. For example, here I'm going to play footage of Corey riding using a wooden skimboard and entering into a distance contest with my former sponsor Dave from Square Skimboards. You'll notice that Dave is using his personal Square skimboard with all the materials and technology in it, and Corey happens to use really good technique and goes just as far as Dave does. Here we have Johnny Weber grills in 2018 on the Victoria lift shape at the Victoria World Champion, sliding out incredibly far on that really good board, that lift shape. But here, 2019, next year at the same contest, Johnny Weber grills on the new Victoria flying fish shape, and he does the same exact thing. Why? Because he's made adjustments to his riding style to make sure that both boards can work for that same situation. It was the same type of wave that he rode. Here we have Sammy Stinnett on a pro shape. This is the sort of older exile shape that's less common these days, but he's always ridden a pro shape, and he's always ridden it with that higher rocker that he has, and he's one of the best skimboarders to ever do it. So even when he goes on the East Coast and competes, he's still riding that pro shape and riding it just fine. Also, Austin Keene on his hybrid shape. So he prefers that a little bit. He likes to do a lot more long wave trimming, like that long frontside wrap every now and again. And that hybrid shape works for him for that. And then at the very extreme end, we have somebody like Brad Domke, who kind of pioneered that double sharp pin, like double dagger or hornet or whatever it's called from Exile, and that he does at his new company that he makes with his own boards. You know, for big conditions, a pin like that will help you, just like the surfboards that big wave riders have, where it really thins out. It's very narrow. So all these boards are worth considering, especially from all these companies, but also I wanted to mention other brands that are available to you. There are a ton of more brands if you go to look them up. Like from the United States, you have brands like Grape, Apex, Wave Zone, and in Hawaii you have Maui Skimmers. Out of Mexico you have Natural Skims, a new brand Lurio. Out of Brazil you have Prime and Kush. If you're in Europe you have Dogfoot, which comes out of Spain, I think. And then if you're in New Zealand or Australia, you might try OXS boards. So there are a ton of options. I hope this clears some of this stuff up when you're shopping for new boards. Again, if you're going for your beginner board, ideally look for that the Exile EXO, that Zap Fish or Wedge, or that Vic Foamy 2.0, especially because they re-released with epoxy, and their price point seems to be $150 to $180, which would make it the cheapest epoxy board that I know of. And then even if you have a little bit more money than that, but maybe not $500, if you're sort of between like $250 and $500, try to find a used carbon board. They are out there. Some people are willing to ship them. Just make sure they ship them correctly and safely. And that's always an option if you don't have the money to just go straight to a carbon epoxy board. And last but not least, there's a constant conversation on what board to get that'll never end. It's the same thing with surfing. If you need more information, go to the Reddit or the Discord for skimboarding. Those links are in the description below. We talk about boards every day there. So thanks for listening. If you have questions, put them in the comments. But more importantly, join those communities so you can get not just my opinion, but everybody's opinion on, maybe you'll talk to somebody who's from the same area that you are or has already tried the board model that you're looking at. I haven't tried every board on the market, so get involved in the community, get more information before you make your purchase.